Hello, my name is David Carr and today I'll be showing you how I made my sculptural freestanding clock whilst I was studying as a student at Cleveland College of Art and Design. After a reasonably lengthy design process and the design of the clock had changed through a few different variations, I finally had a mock-up model that I was happy with to proceed on to making the final item. Because I'd produced a full-scale mock-up in such a way that I could take it back apart, marking out the cutting pattern on the 6mm plywood was a simple matter of disassembling the model, laying out the parts on the plywood to best use the material, and marking around them. These parts were then set aside while I started working on the metal element, as I knew this would take a particularly long time to do. After undertaking some test runs of aluminium planishing to get a sense of how the material worked in the process, I started to mark out the two blanks that I would need before cutting them out of a 3mm thick sheet of aluminium. After removing any sharp burrs from the edges, I then started to work on the planishing of the two forms. This was done roughly first with a small round-headed hammer to create the indentations and start and stretch the material. Once the metal had started to stretch, I could then move to a relatively larger ball-headed hammer to start and create some shape within the bowl. I continued to planish the aluminium sheet whilst working over a hollowed section of foam. This was done specifically so that the finished surface on the other side of the metal didn't encounter anything hard to damage it. I continued on with the planishing until I was achieving around about the correct shape. I also kept checking on the front of the part to ensure that the form was about what I was looking for. I continued on in this way with both parts until they were looking about right and I was ready to move to the next stage. As the protective film was wearing thin over the external faces of the aluminium, I covered these with masking tape to avoid any scuffs or markings to the externals. One of the more technically challenging parts of this build would be getting the two shells of the aluminium to match up perfectly, or as close as humanly possible. To help this along, I cut out a front and back profile from thick birch plywood. The tops of these were slightly rounded over to allow them to sit within the aluminium shells. The idea of doing this is then to tap on the excess aluminium that we don't need to try and flatten the shell against the sides of the profile. To help this process along in particular areas such as at the top and base of the profile where we had gathers of material, relief channels were cut to try and allow the material to fold in on itself. In places such at the bottom where this started to ripple as a result of the hammering on different elements, a metal dolly or form was used to hammer the aluminium over. Whilst doing this, I had to be particularly careful to only hammer the excess on the edge of the aluminium, as hammer blows here create deep grazes into the metal's surface, which I wanted to avoid on the final item. Once I'd reached a certain point, I then continued with the plywood inserts in place and hammering the edges of the aluminium right over to encapsulate it. After this was done, I was able to cut out against the plywood surface, giving me an extra 4 or 5mm on the shell excess. At this stage the shells met up reasonably well, but I proceeded to remove the excess by hand against a flat board. After this, there were only a few very slight undulations where the material hadn't quite met up. To remedy these, I temporarily attached both shells together and then removed any high points, which would then later be polished up to match in with the rest of the shell. Although the aluminium that I'd selected came with a pre-polished surface that was protected by a film, I decided to polish this further. You can see the further polished on the left and the original on the right. I proceeded on in this way to do both halves of the shell, and you can see here that they've come up with quite a gleaming shine. With the planished aluminium shells to a reasonable stage, I then switched back to work on the wooden elements of the clock. As I started to cut out these elements, where applicable I laminated them together. At this stage I only laminated parts which I knew would be blended into each other in form. The remainder of the parts here remain completely separate so that they can be individually shaped and finished. With the lack of mechanical means to cut these parts, which were so close together and had very tight turns, I ended up doing these by hand with a coping saw and a long reach coping saw. Once all of these parts were together, I started to then mark up exactly where needed to be shaped and to what extent. At this stage as well, despite the original design calling for apertures that projected directly through the body of the clock, I decided to go against this idea, as otherwise it may have visually cluttered the clock and added too heavy of detail to the body element. With the finalised form now sorted, I proceeded on to sculpt around most of the plywood parts. This was done by hand using a range of different tools before sanding them to a good surface finish. Once this had been done, I was able to start and laminate up the different layers. Whilst doing this, I was mindful to offset the bottom of each part to create the different offset levels. With all of the parts of the clock together, this would then create the natural cantilever and mean only a minimal amount would need sanding from the base to flat it off. Now as the wooden element of the clock was nearing its completion, I was able to start and merge both of the metal and wooden elements together. The back metal shell of the clock was designed to permanently stay in place. Because of this, I carefully cut and filed out 2 apertures so that it would slide over the inner sheath. The end idea of this ultimately would be for the wooden form to be cradling the metal element. At this stage I also further altered the wooden element that would sit within the shell. This was altered to allow the clock mechanism to sit in place and also to have a relief channel so that the wood could expand against the side of the metal. At this stage I was now able to finalise the location of the hole for the clock pointers. This was then bored through the front element of the shell. With all of these different elements now complete, I was able to apply a few coats of glossy water-based varnish to the wooden elements of the clock. To hold the front metal shell in place onto the clock, I decided to use magnets. These were set into place on top of Carr body filler within the inside of the shell. Once cured, the Carr body filler here would then be sculpted back to a more pleasing form and also to reduce the weight high up within the clock. After the back metal shell had been bonded permanently onto the wooden elements of the clock, I proceeded to glue magnets onto the wooden former within the clock shell. This would allow the front metal shell to be held temporarily into place and align properly with the other back half of the metal shell. That was the final stage in the building of the freestanding sculptural clock. The clock is made from laminated marine birch plywood and hand planished aluminium. The design of the sculptural clock was influenced heavily by aquatic and marine forms, along with the sculptural works of Tony Cragg.